Right. Well, good evening, everyone. Wherever in the world you are, it's nice to have people back again. Just a brief word of introduction for those who weren't here last time. So the aim of these really is to prepare for Advent and Christmas, to explore the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, but using each week a painting as a peg. Now, if you were here last week, you realize I couldn't restrict myself to one painting. But there's one painting which is going to be the peg leading us through the whole session. And so I plan to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we have brief time if there are any questions people want to correct me. Look at any of the paintings again. It's the delight of having visuals here. So, Amy, I'm going to ask you to do your stuff. If you could share to the meeting. Scroll up. Okay, can you all see that on Zoom? Yep. Okay. Could you start the slides? Excellent, thank you. Okay, so last week we were in Renaissance Florence. Now we're going to jump about 130 years and south from Florence to Rome. Now, in case you think you've come to the wrong place, Nicolas Poussin is French. He was born in Normandy, but he spent much of his career in Rome. So he arrived in Rome in 1624, so about 10 years before this painting was painted, where, among others, he was under the patronage of Cardinal Francesco Barberini, one of the famous Barberini family, who produced at least one, maybe more than one pope. So he was the nephew of Pope Urban VIII. So he was quite a good patron to have if you are a budding artist in the city of Rome. So that's a little bit of the background. And this is his Nativity and Adoration of the Shepherds, which is now in the National Gallery in London. But originally, at least very soon after it was painted, it was in the private collection of another cardinal, Cardinal Giancarlo di Medici, so one of the famous Medici family, in his villa near Florence. And so it's quite likely that this was commissioned by Cardinal de Medici. And there may be a little Florentine recognition a bit later on. In many ways, it's a conventional depiction of the adoration of the shepherds. What I mean by conventional will become clear as we go through. But people often note its very subdued colours, except, of course, for the blue, which really comes out around the earth red, or some people call it coppery shades of the rest of the painting. Now, just in terms of how this might fit into the gospel narratives, there's an excellent book. I don't know if you haven't come across this, go and buy it now. John Drury, who was at one point Dean of Christ Church in Oxford, and then Chaplain of All Souls. He taught in Cambridge for a long time. He's a New Testament scholar with a very strong interest in art history, and he produced this book in conjunction with the National Gallery in London, Painting the Word. And the bulk of the paintings he discusses are in the National Gallery collection, including the Poussin. And he suggests that Poussin has very skillfully brought together two different emphases. The emphasis of Luke, that is the realism, the down-to-earthness of Luke, and the more abstract, almost mystical character of John, particularly the prologue of John. In the beginning was the Word, and then the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And so there's the kind of earthiness, the down-to-earthness, combined with this sense of descent, heavenly descent, symbolized by the little angels at the top. But we'll come back to the details of Poussin's paintings in a little while, and how they flesh out or develop elements in the biblical text. But for now, just note a few of them, which we'll come back to. So first of all, the elegant but crumbling classical buildings supporting the makeshift stable. Very common feature of adorations of the shepherds and adorations of the Magi from the Renaissance, particularly from Northern Europe, and it finds its way south into Italian art. The donkey at the center, and why the donkey is positioned where he or she is. The shepherds and the Holy Family turned into a group of worshippers, which interestingly is not explicitly mentioned in Luke's text. Believe me, I'm a New Testament scholar, and I only noticed this afternoon. Shame on me. I wasn't reading Luke's text closely enough. Anyway, we'll come back to that. It's not inappropriate to worship the Christ child, but it's not actually explicitly mentioned there in the text. And then the way in which an artist are able to do this in a particular way, the way in which two scenes which are temporarily sequential are able to be presented together in the same canvas. And so we have the shepherds adoring at the front, but then in the background we have the angels receiving the angelic message. And so those two scenes, the one which leads to this moment of adoration, is presented to us there in the background. Okay, so I said it's conventional, more or less, but I wanted to go back to another nativity scene, which is a few centuries earlier. This is also in the National Gallery. This is in the other National Gallery, the National Gallery of Art in Washington. But there is a connection with London, which will become clear in a moment. I'm showing you Duccio, not because it is compositionally similar to what we have in Poussin, but because Duccio is often considered to be representative of that turning point from effectively a Byzantine style of Christian iconography to something which is more characteristically Western and more realistic. So there is the stable, which we associate in the West with the Nativity, but notice that the stable is encased in a cave. And the cave, which again is not in the biblical text, goes back to that text I mentioned last week, the Proto-Evangelium of James, this apocryphal gospel, infancy gospel, the one which has Joseph as an elderly man, late 2nd century. So already in the 2nd century, the birth of Christ is associated with a cave. And if you go on pilgrimage to Bethlehem, you'll be taken to a cave underneath the Church of the Nativity. But before I say more about those details, I want to pay attention to the title of this, the Nativity with the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel. Isaiah is on the left and Ezekiel is on the right. And they both have open scrolls, which are words of their prophecies, which in the Middle Ages were considered to be fulfilled in events in the life of Christ. Some of them, of course, are taken from Matthew's Gospel. This happened in order that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. But do you notice anything strange about Isaiah on the left? If this is the Nativity with the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel.
Looking the wrong way.
He's looking the wrong way. Because he is not looking at the Nativity in Washington, he is looking across the pond to the National Gallery in London to the Annunciation. Because all these bits were originally part of this huge altarpiece which was designed by Duccio for Siena Cathedral, known as the Maestà. This is just the Ravenna panel at the bottom, which had scenes from the life of Christ with prophets prophesying each of those. But anyway, ignore the fact that Isaiah is not looking at the Nativity, it's Ezekiel who's looking at the Nativity, as well as the cave. We have the conventional elderly Joseph in the pink, sitting on the far left. We have below Mary two midwives. Again, no midwives in Luke. But there is a midwife in the Proto-Evangelium of James. When the child is born, Joseph goes to find a Hebrew midwife, which might remind you of another place in the Bible where Hebrew midwives are discussed, and that is at the birth of Moses. Hebrew midwives hide the Israelite children in Egypt so that they're not destroyed, they're not killed. And so we get a connection of this idea that Jesus is a new Moses being played out with the introduction of a midwife. And then she goes and finds another woman who is called Salome, who also comes to witness the birth of Christ. In other words, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, who later will be two of Christ's disciples. And then we have the shepherds and the angelic announcement and the heavenly host. So a number of features which we'll be exploring again because they are dominant in Luke's account of the nativity and the adoration of the shepherds. Okay, so let's come to Luke now, and I'm going to take Luke's nativity story in basically 3 bits. So this is Poussin's main source text for his nativity and adoration of the shepherds. And it's by far the most extensive account of the nativity of Christ in the Gospels. Matthew has half a verse. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, something else happened. That's something else we'll think about next week. And so it's only Luke really who has a nativity story proper. And it begins in a way which firmly embeds the birth of Christ in the story of Rome and Rome's imperial expansion. So in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. This was the first enrollment when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be enrolled, each to his own city. Okay, so I'm going to sidestep for the moment the complex historical issues concerning the census. Which seems not to have taken place until about 10 years after Christ was born. and was not an empire-wide event. There were not people moving in all directions at the time. Read a commentary on Luke for the discussions about the issues to do with the census. But I want to focus on this connection with Rome and with Caesar Augustus. Luke's nativity story is one which touches the very fabric of the Roman political realm. And Roman perceptions of its first emperor, that is Octavian, or the Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 40 CE, who is mentioned, as you'll see, explicitly by name. Luke reminds us that it was in the reign of Augustus Caesar that Jesus was born. Come back to Augustus in a moment, but to go back to Poussin, this helps explain the architectural dimensions of Poussin's painting, and indeed of many paintings of the Adoration of the Shepherds. In the background, you have, first of all, these two columns, the left one of which is broken, so as to support the rather rickety stable. There's a triumphal arch behind that, which is also crumbling. And there is a solid wall to the right, with a few cracks in it. So this is a very common feature of Nativity and Adoration scenes. And it's making the point which is already implicit in Luke's narrative, that the old is beginning to crumble. And of course, by the time that Poussin painted, Roman culture was incredibly old. And the crumbling of the old is anticipating and giving way to a new world, which is being brought about by the birth of this child. Now, what were Poussin's models for this? Well, of course, he had his artistic predecessors. He may well have had a vivid imagination, but he didn't need a vivid imagination. He just had to go out on the streets and walk around Rome. Some of you may have walked through the Roman Forum, the heart of Rome. Imagine the Roman Forum before it was properly excavated and reconstructed. It was known as the Campo Vaccino, the field of cows. It was basically a load of ruins right in the center of Rome, crumbling triumphal arches and crumbling columns, a pasture for cows. Of course, the cow, the ox, is not only prominently featured in the Nativity, but in Christian tradition, it becomes the symbol of Luke the evangelist. And so there is, below this, there is an ox to the far right of the painting. So with the birth of Christ, this new world is coming to be born out of this crumbling classical world. Okay, so we can see the cow there, the ox. That's what you would have seen if you walked through the Roman Forum in the mid-17th century. Okay, so let's come back to Joseph, because Joseph is now the main character in the first part of the Nativity story in Luke. Now, we saw last week how Matthew presents Joseph as a very taciturn but obedient son of David, who provides Christ with his Davidic genealogy, his Davidic ancestry. So he's the kind of penultimate figure at the climax of the family tree, and we saw how the Joseph coming down the stairs in Piero di Cosimo's painting is indication that he has finished his job. He's got to the top of the stairs, which is the top of the genealogy. He has handed Christ over, now newly minted as a Davidic king, and he can come down having completed his work. Luke also emphasizes Joseph's Davidic descent, but he does it not through his genealogy, but by Joseph traveling to Bethlehem, which is the hometown of David, so that the child is born in the city of David. More or less. Okay, what do I mean by more or less? Sorry, I'm confusing you. That was only partly deliberate. I'm slightly confusing you because Luke says something very strange, which you might not notice because you are very familiar with the nativity story. Or you might not notice it because, and this is why I have opted today for the Revised Standard Version rather than the New Revised Standard Version, which obscures something. And Joseph also went up. Not Joseph went, but Joseph went up from the city of David to Judea, to the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. Pay attention to that verb, anabino. Joseph also went up. Now, as far as I know, there are only two places in the world to which people go up. One is Oxford, and the other is Jerusalem. So when Luke writes, Joseph also went up, the expectation is that he's going up to Jerusalem. Okay, so that's your expectation. Imagine you have never read Luke's Gospel before. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea. Now, where is Jerusalem? In Judea. Okay. To the city of David. Now, what's the city of David? Every time the phrase city of David appears in the Old Testament, it's a reference to Jerusalem. So, if you're an attentive reader of Luke, you know what's coming. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. See what he does? So that the great city of David, David's capital Jerusalem, has been displaced by the little town of Bethlehem, 6 miles down the road, which was, of course, David's ancestral home, but not his capital. This Lucan idea of marginality, it's not at the center where the great reception takes place. And so we are being redirected to another city of David, which is Bethlehem. Okay, so they arrived in Bethlehem, and Luke tells us that the time came for Mary to give birth. And this theme of marginality continues. What did Mary do when she gave birth to the child? She swathed him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the reception area or in the guest room. Not the inn. There's a perfectly good Greek word for inn, which Luke uses in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which he does not use here. He uses the word here that he will use for the upper room where the Last Supper takes place. So the effect is that Jesus is excluded from the main area where the guests would stay in the house, and it might be a family house in Bethlehem. And instead, Mary is forced to place her child in the animal's food trough. Now, people who are experts on Luke, I don't know if you've come across Michael Parsons at all, teaches at Baylor University in Texas, really excellent Lucan scholar. He makes a couple of points about this placing of Jesus after he is born. The first is he reminds us of the name, the etymology of the place, Bethlehem, the house of bread. And then we have a child who is placed in an eating trough, a feeding trough, as if he is the food. And this idea, which runs throughout Luke, that Christ is encountered at meals, that he is the host, is already being anticipated here. This association between Christ and food, Christ as nourishment for the nations, being played out already here. But there's another dimension as well, which I think visual artists have been particularly good at identifying, and that is the way in which what Mary does foreshadows a scene later in the gospel. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and she laid him in a manger with Joseph watching. Later on, another Joseph will take the dead body of Jesus, wrap it in a burial shroud, and lay it in a tomb. The Nativity prefigures the Passion. Already here, you can see potentially, it's not quite as clear as in some images, but Poussin here, the child is being wrapped not so much in bands of cloth, but in something that could pass for a burial shroud. But this idea is even clearer in some other adorations of the shepherds. So going back to Duccio, the child is so tightly bound it can't move. It's almost a corpse. And
no.
If you look at icons and early Western depictions of the entombment of Christ, there is a visual similarity. Christ is also, of course, placed in a cave, a rock tomb, and so there's a visual similarity between the cave of the Nativity and the cave of the burial, the body of the child and the body of the dead Christ. So this is a very early recognition in Christian art, both in the East and in the West, that the Nativity is prefiguring the burial of Christ. And here is something closer to home for some of us, the Ashmolean, the Museum in Oxford. This was painted by a Flemish artist who went rogue and travelled south to Italy. The Adoration of the Shepherds here, and you'll see that Christ is actually on a stone slab, as if it is a sacrificial altar, and his arms are outstretched, almost in a cruciform pattern. And there is a shepherd there with a big bowl, as if he's ready to catch the blood when it flows out, and offer that as a sacrificial offering. It's a libation bowl. And you get the same idea of the crumbling Roman world around the figure of this new birth, which is taking place, and a very prominent Lucan ox that's behind Mary. Okay, and look, here's another one from Domenico Ghirlandaio. This is in Florence. Okay, it was painted for a burial chapel. But notice how the manger is a sarcophagus. Christ is about to be placed in the tomb. And this is kind of interesting in many ways, not least because, as well as these classical columns and inscriptions mentioning Pompey, who was the Roman general who invaded Jerusalem, so that the Romans took control of Jerusalem at that point. In the triumphal arch to the left, there's not only an inscription mentioning Pompey, but also mentioning Nicolas, who was the Jewish high priest, as if to say the old temple and the triumphal arches of the Roman world are now being replaced or giving way to this new world, which is brought about by the birth of this child. Okay, so finally we come to the shepherds, who are the main characters, along with the Holy Family in Poussin's paintings. We may, probably because what we've seen or what we've heard, may assume that all the shepherds were men, but Luke doesn't say they were all men. And there were female shepherds in Israel, mentioned in the Old Testament. Rachel is one. And Poussin has both male and female characters in the group adoring Christ. But what are we to make of the shepherds in Luke? Why does Luke have shepherds rather than magi coming to witness the birth of Christ? Well, sometimes you read in commentaries that shepherds had a reputation for being rather disreputable, violent, involved in petty crime. The British would say dodgy. That kind of idea. This may be the case, but such a view of shepherds is dependent upon later rabbinic sources. So we can't be sure that Jews at the time of Luke thought this about shepherds, but certainly, and this does fit into the broader motif of Luke's gospel, they are figures on the fringes because their occupation required them to be out in the fields day and night. So therefore, they could not involve themselves in the social and religious life of their communities. So they're very different from the Gentile magi with their exotic gifts that we'll think about next week. But marginal as they are, they also remind us of another shepherd from Bethlehem, David. So it's appropriate that when the king, the son of David, is born, that David, like shepherds of Bethlehem, come to witness the event. Okay, so that's the shepherds, but then what we have here is an annunciation. Now, because if most of us are asked to imagine the annunciation, we imagine the angel Gabriel and Mary. Luke, of course, has three annunciations, not one. The annunciation to Zechariah of the birth of John, the annunciation to Mary of the birth of Jesus, and the annunciation to the shepherds of the birth of Jesus. And the pattern is the same for all of them, except there's no objection on the part of the shepherds. Angelic announcements of a significant birth. But going back to Poussin's crumbling classical ruins, and Luke's statement that Jesus was born during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. If you have that in mind, then the message of the angel making the announcement is saturated with language which would remind Luke's readers of what the empire said about the emperor, and particularly what the empire had said about the emperor Augustus. Okay, so in that region, there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Then an angel of the Lord stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid, for see, I am bringing you good news, gospel of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Saviour, who is the Messiah, the Lord." The only time in the Synoptic Gospels that Jesus is called Saviour. Now, I'm going to read you another Gospel, which was found in the city of Priene in Western Asia Minor, dated to 9 BCE, and then found in a number of other cities in Asia Minor. And it's a reference to Augustus. Since Providence has put in order everything in our lives and is deep interested in our lives, she has set everything in perfect order by giving us Augustus for the great benefit of men, whom she filled with virtue, so that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a saviour for us and for our descendants, to end war and to put everything in the cosmos in order. He, by his appearance, went beyond all our expectations and beyond all previous helpers, and not leaving to the future any hope of accomplishing more than what he has done. And since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of good tidings, gospels, euangelia, for the world he established. This is a gospel, Saviour, who brought peace, birth, God, gospel. I bring you gospel of great joy. You is born in the city of David a Saviour, who is the Messiah, the Lord. And this took place in the reign of the Emperor Augustus. So, those crumbling ruins make sense in the light of that alternative gospel of a birth in the reign of the Emperor Augustus. So here I said Poussin has interwoven these two scenes, which in Luke's Gospel are sequential. We've got, first of all, the event which started it all for the shepherds, which was the announcement of the angel, just about make up the angel over the support of the stable, and then the shepherds filled with awe, they saw afraid. The old translation has it, and then it's as if there is a direct path leading there over the back of the donkey down to the Holy Family. So everything is connecting us to this adoration which is taking place. So the shepherds have heard, and now they come to see what they have heard. Okay, so few details in Poussin's painting. First of all, we've mentioned the group of shepherds includes two women, one of whom is carrying a large basket of fruit. Now, if this is painted for Cardinal de' Medici, a Florentine cardinal, member of the great Medici family, apparently there was a Florentine custom to bring baskets of fruit to women after a successful birth. And so this may be playing into that. And so this is appropriate for the time for a birth which has taken place. But what are the shepherds doing as well as adoring? They are looking. And Luke, and Poussin picks up on this, Luke places a very strong emphasis upon seeing as part of this. So the angel tells the shepherds that the child wrapped in swaddling clothes will be a sign for them, something to be seen, pointing beyond itself. The shepherds go to Bethlehem, they say, let us go to see the thing which has taken place. Actually, it's the Greek word is rhema, which can be translated word, to see the word which has taken place. And then they saw it, and when they saw it, they went and made known what had been told them. In other words, as Luke is portraying them, they become the first preachers of the gospel. They have heard the good news from the angel, they have seen, and they make known the word that they have seen and the word that they have heard. And then they go away rejoicing, returning, praising God, glorifying and praising God. Almost the same phrase is used right at the end of Luke's gospel of the disciples after the ascension. They return to Jerusalem and they're constantly in the temple praising God. So the sense that the story of the Nativity ends with people who prefigure the activity of the disciples in preaching the good news. They have received an angelic gospel, an alternative to the Augustan gospel, and so they now go out and spread the word, particularly related to what they have seen. But then, primarily, this is an act of adoration. As I said, as I noted for the first time today, Luke does not say that they worshipped the child. Matthew tells us the Magi worshipped. Luke doesn't tell us that the shepherds worship. But although the child is off center, the child becomes the focus of attention and adoration. So notice, first of all, the hands of the shepherd in front. There's almost a kind of triangular shape moving down to the hands which are pointing towards the child. And then the angels, similarly, the triangular shape comes to a point with the angelic feet, which are pointing down directly to the child. So everything is directing our attention to the child. The posture of the shepherds, the one at the front, almost prostrate on the ground, is this posture of worship. So this is clearly a moment of adoration, and it seems that even the non-human and the creation is involved. So the donkey and the ox also seem to be attentive to the child who has been born. Here's another adoration, quite a bit earlier from Venice, Giorgione, only two shepherds here. But again, this idea that this moment is a moment of adoration and contemplation. The only appropriate human response is to fall down, worship, or to contemplate. And the model here is Mary. So she looked both at the posture, the face, but then also the way in which her hands are joined in prayer. So she's kind of got it. She knows how to adore. She knows how to contemplate. And then the shepherd nearest the middle is copying Mary. Almost the same posture. And Joseph is fiddling with his thumbs as if he hasn't quite got it. It takes a while to learn how to worship and contemplate. And I think it's a very interesting depiction of that, learning how to respond appropriately. It's a kind of masterclass in learning how the worship. But I want to finish with Domenico Ghirlandaio. This is not Poussin, sorry, but this is kind of plug for next week. We're not looking at Ghirlandaio either, but Ghirlandaio's Adoration of the Shepherds is a much busier scene than Poussin's. The reason for that, of course, is that there are other characters on the way. There is a sprawling procession of not only magi, but their extensive entourage. Well, I may something next week about how this might relate to what regularly happened through the streets of Florence, round about the Feast of the Epiphany, and how the Medici were involved in that. This was commissioned for a burial chapel of someone who worked in the Medici bank, and some people think he might be, this might be a kind of veiled insult to the Medici, to the bosses, because the Magi are late. The Magi are associated with the Medici. It's these poor shepherds who have made it first, and the Magi are still on their way. The Adoration of the Magi was actually far more influential, more popular in Christian art than Luke's Adoration of the Shepherds, really until St. Francis of Assisi staged his living creche at Greccio with live animals. And so it's also a reminder of how Matthew's narrative of the Nativity is very, very different. So today we've been thinking about the Adoration of the Shepherds. Next time we'll be thinking about the Adoration of the Magi through another tondo, another round painting. This one started by the great Dominican artist Fra Angelico and finished by the Carmelite Fra Filippo Lippi. So if you come back next week, you'll be able to explore that with me. Okay, so we've got about 12 minutes. If people have any questions or would like to look at another painting again, any details that interested you?
Not from the paintings. I was going to ask about the date of the Proto-Evangelion James that seems to be.
Yes, so it's probably late 2nd century. Very popular. And then, of course, so very popular in the East. And then it was expanded by various people. So there's a Western text called the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, which probably in present form is 7th century. And that is basically an expanded version of the Proto-Evangelion James, which was influential in the West. And then it got into drama in the Middle Ages, and then the Golden Legend, which was a massive book, collected lots of traditions about the saints and about the life of Christ. And so some of these details were popularized there. And then, of course, they find their way into art, and some into liturgy and devotional practices. And so, sort of Cave, the elderly Joseph, the midwives, they almost become part of the living biblical text.
So a lot of the things we see in these paintings that refer to either points that from those sort of stories or things that we haven't picked up just on that cursory reading of the gospel.
Yeah.
Were they quite well known then to people at the time, do you think? It's not painters have just sort of worked them out.
And of course, if the paintings are commissioned, then the patron will often know what they want. Anyway, but there are, as you can see, particularly with the crumbling classical buildings, the presence of the oxen, the ass. There are certain fixed features, and some kind of come in. So the crumbling, the classical buildings, they start to come in Netherlandish paintings, yeah, late Middle Ages, and then they become fixed points. Whereas earlier things like the ox and the ass, the elderly Joseph, they go way back. And so yeah, some become almost required. And so when an artist breaks with convention, it's often very illuminating. Okay, so I couldn't see the second part of the comment.
Then my question is, do we know what gospel people heard in the Middle Ages on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and whether they heard it in the vernacular or in Latin? And if only in Latin, were people then dependent on pictorial representations to know the Christmas scene?
Yeah, great question. So I'll probably need to check the lecture. So for the most part, Matthew and John were most widely read, but it's quite likely that Luke's nativity story would have been read at Christmas in some way. But of course, yes, people would have heard it in Latin. So it's often through, not only through art, but also through preaching. And so, something like the Golden Legend was often a springboard for preachers in the Middle Ages. And then some of these details come into kind of paraliturgical texts, so processions, hymns, and of course drama. So there's a lot of biblical drama, and so people encounter the biblical story dramatically as well. And so it's a whole range of possibilities. But yes, your average person in the street, I would say person in the pew because they didn't have pews, would not understand what was being read or sung, but they would receive it in other ways. And I think so. Preaching was quite robust, but then these stories being told in other contexts as well. So, but certainly the visual dimension, and of course there were lots of altarpieces depicting the Nativity, the Adoration of Shepherds, Adoration of the Magi. So that the visual reception would have been very strong.
Is there any notion that the prominence of the donkeys in both indicate they're looking to the future when they may carry him on Palm Sunday?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Bill. And sometimes it is when we get to the very last painting of the series, if you can stay that long. William Holman Hunt's The Triumph of the Innocents. There's a very clear, I mean, this is 19th century, but there are antecedents to this. There is a very clear connection being drawn to Palm Sunday. There it's the donkey that takes them down to Egypt. I mean, again, that's an embellishment on biblical text. But this idea that the infancy narratives prefigure the Passion is something that gets picked up. And there is a painting actually by, I'm not sure it's not Poussin actually. It's not the flight into Egypt, it's the return from Egypt. And you can see the the cross on the donkey's back, and the child is looking at the cross. So that's another connection. And this, why do donkeys always have a cross on their back? This connection with the passion, and so that is clearly made. I'll probably have to look to see other examples of that, but there are places where there are clearly connections being made between a donkey and the Passion, whether it's Palm Sunday, as in the Holman Hunt, or the cross specifically. So yeah, people are making these connections, and then animals. They're often, sometimes they seem to have a very deep interior life. My cat is like that. I kind of think my cat is a profound meditator. She kind of sits there all day contemplating. And these animals, if you look at the eyes, the intensity of the eyes as they're depicted here, they're clearly seeing something. Whether they're looking directly at the child or they're looking at the scene, there is an intensity about the eyes which is significant. Okay, well, it's just coming up to 8:30 our time. So thank you again for being here. Wonderful to see so many, and hopefully see some of you again next week. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Very much, Ian.
Is there another comment? Jennifer, did you have a comment? I just saw it flash up. Screen.
I think I'm not sure. It's the Adoration of the Magi in King's College Chapel, Cambridge. I think Jesus, when presented with the myrrh by one of the kings, he's holding his hand out with his palm facing, as if to say, "I don't want this."
Right.
Kind of symbolic of the myrrh that's going to be used at his burial.
Yes.
It just struck me what you were saying about the adoration.
Yes. And I haven't seen that. I'm just going to have a look, but there are similar kind of ideas where the infant Christ is, recoiling as if in horror from.
Yeah, that's what I was. Yeah.
Sees what is to happen. And so, I think sometimes in the flight into Egypt, you get that as well. And so there's this rather like the Gethsemane moment, but retrojecting back into the childhood.
Yeah.
But I must, next time I'm in Cambridge, I must go and look at that.
Yeah.
But yes, I've seen similar kinds of things. That idea that Gethsemane begins in the childhood.
Well, it's Rubens, isn't it? It's the altar piece at the back of the altar in King's College.
Right. Yeah. So it might be. I can look online and see it.
Yeah. I think it's a fairly often depicted.
Any excuse to go to Cambridge, so I will.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's. Thank you.
Thank you very much.